Hello, good afternoon, everyone. So thank you very much for joining this important session. This session is talk about Task Force 2 outcome on the well-being, environmental sustainability, and just transition. I am Akio Takemoto of UNIS. Then I am contributing also to the issue paper, which is soon published. Today, I invite the co-chairs on the work of this topic. First of all, I'd like to introduce Dr. Dennis Noor, who is founder and the president of Global Solution Institute, and also she's Task Force Think7 Japan co-chair. And he's an expert on labor economics, socio-economics, public policy, and inflation employment trade-offs. The next speaker is Professor Kazuo Matsushita. He's also the co-chair of the Task Force 2, and he's a senior fellow, Institute for Global Environment Strategy, Professor Emeritus, Kyoto University. And he has long been engaged in environmental administration, particularly global environmental policies. The next speaker is Professor Shinobu Yamaguchi. She's the director of UNU Institute for Advanced Study of Sustainability. He's also a co-chair of Task Force 2. And her fields of specialization include international development cooperation, ICT in education, and others. And the next panelist is Dr. Dina Askareva, Senior Research Fellow of ADBI. Her research focuses on energy policy, particularly renewable energy, energy efficiency, and energy storage. Now, we'd like to launch the sessions. First of all, I want to briefly overview the outcome of the Task Force 2 issue paper. Could you show up the one-page slide introduction of the list of policy recommendations? So there, I know that there are a lot of important discussions so far, but many experts say it's important to promote the 2030 agenda and also Paris Agreement through the integrated and holistic approach on their list of actions recommended to G7 leaders, collaboration with G20 members. One is universal access to carbon neutrality energy systems and promote sustainable food systems and biodiversity conservation, enhance resilience, social protection, and social sustainability, and finance for promoting the just transition, create annual consistent mechanisms to measure just transition, environmental sustainability, and well-being, strengthen partnerships for climate sustainable development, and enhance capacity to promote education and youth empowerment. So today, all these panelists and real experts who are keen to these actions. So now I'd like to invite Professor Matsushita. I have pose a question to him. So there are a lot of global crises, not only climate, energy, but also food, Ukraine, or many inflations. So there are big challenges and gaps to promote SDGs and the climate action, as was mentioned at the previous session. So I'd like to ask you how the world, particularly G7 leaders, take this action. Floor is yours.
Thank you very much, Takemoto-san, Dr. Takemoto, for your kind introduction. As you have rightly stated, progress towards achieving the SDGs and the Paris Agreement is not on track to be met. And the world is now facing triple global crises: climate change, biodiversity loss, and environmental pollution. And some of the planetary boundaries are already breached. Behind these crises lie the fact that our economic activities, the way we consume and produce, have become unsustainable. Furthermore, the Russian invasion of Ukraine has exacerbated the energy crisis. A healthy environment is both a prerequisite and a foundation for economic prosperity and human health and well-being. As such, integrated approaches are needed to simultaneously address human well-being and environmental sustainability. The G7 summit in Hiroshima is expected to discuss strategies how the G7 nations can confront these crises in a world where the climate crisis and energy crisis are advancing simultaneously, and at the same time strengthening the well-being of everyone on Earth. As a prerequisite to taking on these challenges, I believe it is important to consider the following 3 points. First, respond seriously to the message of the latest scientific findings, especially the IPCC Sixth Assessment Report. I would like to emphasize that these reports have recommended integrated approaches to sustainability. The SDGs are a good starting point for the G7 to ramp up integrated approaches. Second, build on the agreement reached at the last year's G7 summit, as well as the achievement at COP27 of UNFCCC Climate Convention and COP15 of CBD, Climate Convention on Biological Diversity. Third, respond to the voice of the Global South in close collaboration with SDGs. And in response to the IPCC Sixth Assessment Report, UN Secretary General Antonio Guterres stated that humanity is on thin ice, and that ice is melting fast. He also said that the climate time bomb is ticking. He called for net zero electricity generation by 2035 for all developed countries. Second, net zero targets by as close as possible to 2040 for developed countries. Third, no new coal and the phasing out of coal by 2030 in OECD countries and 2040 in all other countries. Fourth, ceasing all licensing of funding of new oil and gas. Fifth, shifting subsidies from fossil fuels to just energy transition. Sixth, establishing global phase down of existing oil and gas production. Seven, safeguarding the most vulnerable communities and scaling up finance and capacities for adaptation and loss and damage. Against these background, and based on the Task Force 2 issue paper, I would like to emphasize that these 7 leaders, in close collaboration with other group of 20 leaders, should reignite action for the SDGs, carbon neutrality, and climate resilient development. And through an integrated and holistic approach, considering well-being, environmental sustainability, and just transition to staying with planetary boundaries. These actions must include effective measures related to finance, science and technology, governance, capacity building, and education based on scientific evidence. And in particular, in the area of climate change, I would like to emphasize the following points. First, accelerate the speed of renewable energy expansion, invest in necessary grid infrastructure, and expand battery and other storage capacities. Second, move up to net zero targets to around 2040, following the IPCC recommendation. Third, eliminate remaining subsidies for fossil fuels. Fourth, phase out coal by use by 2030. Sixth, support just transition. Sixth, phase out the conventional motor in the transport sector by 2035 at the latest, and expand electric and public mobility. 7, green hydrogen and its derivatives, such as ammonia, should be developed and used where they are effective in emission reduction and advancing decarbonization, notably in hard-to-abate sectors in industry and transportation, and not for coal-firing in thermal power generation. Finally, I would like to reiterate the importance of strengthening the science policy interface in policy making. It is crucial to bridge the gap between scientific research and policy formulation to create evidence-based policies that address the current and future challenges faced by the world. It also helps in shaping policies that are evidence-based, effective, and efficient, which can lead to better outcomes for society as a whole. Thank you very much for your kind attention.
Yeah, thank you very much, Professor Matsushita. Thank you very much for your comprehensive introduction and also your message to address this issue. Now I'd like to ask Dr. Dina. Dina, you're working for ADBI. ADBI's mission is provide financial technical support, mainly in Asian developing countries. So from this context, I think it's very important to provide us support on technology transfer and financing, and also to promote just energy transition. So I'd like to know how can they further accelerate clean energy transition, in particular the global north, and also how can G7 promote, replace inefficient, not targeted fossil fuel subsidies, and for low-income groups to prevent energy poverty. Floor is yours.
Many thanks for excellent question, very important. But before I start answering question, please let me highlight the benefits of energy transition. Many people mentioned today to limit global temperature rise in order to avoid catastrophic climate change. But a part of global targets, there are also local benefits for countries. For example, reducing air pollution, lots of air pollution caused by fossil fuels, which is harming for humans' health. Another benefit, for example, include job creation and employment. So I want to summarize that there are local benefits, including also energy security, because fossil fuels is a diminishing resource, also non-renewable. So now coming to your question, how to accelerate this energy transition. You know, fossil fuel is highly polluting, and among fossil fuel, coal, like mentioned before about the coal. And I would like to, since time is limited, please let me just focus on the two directions regarding coal-based power plants, ending new and retiring existing. So G7 calls to end new unabated coal-based power plants. Unabated means power plants which don't have pollution reduction technologies, for example, carbon capture and storage. So G7 calls globally all countries as soon as possible to end unabated, to not install new unabated coal-based power plants. And multilateral development banks like ADB support this. For example, ADB formalized in energy policy not financing new coal-based power plants. Second direction, retire existing. So G7 calls to accelerate phase out of existing unabated coal-based power plants. But power plants cannot be shut down because people need energy. So what needs to be done? They need to be replaced. So here, renewable energy is not enough because renewable energy is a highly intermittent, non-reliable energy source. You know, there are clouds, wind speed changing. So in order to make renewable energy reliable, other technologies are needed. For example, energy storage, like lithium-ion batteries or green hydrogen. Unfortunately, most of these technologies are very, very expensive. and they need significant investments. And here G7 can actually help with driving costs down by investing in research, development, demonstration, scaling up in order to make these technologies more affordable, especially for the global south. Example of coal plant retirement has ADB-led energy transition mechanism. It's a program which mobilize funds from different sources and then use them to retire coal power plants on earlier than they would be otherwise, and then use funds to replace with renewable energy plus energy storage and so on. And this already started with 3 pilot countries, Indonesia, Philippines, and Vietnam, and it can be scaled to other regions as well. Now, coming to removing fossil fuel subsidies, this is a very important topic, and actually G7 countries committed to remove fossil fuel subsidies by 2025, and calling also other countries to do so. They were heavily criticized, fossil fuel subsidies, they were heavily criticized for their inefficiency, non-targeted, and also causing huge burden for public expenditure. For example, ADB estimated that fossil fuel subsidies in Indonesia were around 4% of GDP in 2012. However, we have to acknowledge our recent situation. The war in Ukraine caused price increase of energy, and then actually many countries not reduced fossil fuel subsidies, but even increased. Last year, fossil fuel subsidies doubled, and that was used as a quick, immediate, short-term solution to address energy security issues, energy poverty issues, because people need energy. But of course, countries need plan how to deal with these inefficient fossil fuel subsidies. So we understand that they cannot be just removed because of energy poverty and energy security issues, but they need to be replaced with something more efficient and more targeted solutions. I would like to finish my talk by highlighting importance of just energy transition, which you mentioned. A part of the benefits, energy transition actually have negative side effects as well. Negative side effects, people who will be affected, mainly employed, who rely on income employment from coal sector, let's say coal-based power plant, they will lose employment. And although globally this picture of how many people employed in coal is just 0.25% globally, but as you zoom in, you can see that most of employment in coal comes from Asia. And if you continue to zoom in, there are countries heavily dependent on coal employment. That's, for example, People's Republic of China, India, Indonesia. And if you continue to zoom in, you'll see provinces and local communities who heavily depend on coal employment and income. For example, Indonesia, there is province East Kalimantan, where 1/3 of GDP and 1/10 of employment comes from coal. So when we do just energy transition, countries need to think how to increase the benefit of energy transition and reduce the negative side effects. What could be done in this direction? Reskilling, reemployment, repurposing coal power plants. So not just shutting them down, but actually repurposing. So that will make sure that there is employment for local communities and small provinces to find a job. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much, Dina. So I'd like to touch upon your last remarks on how to promote phasing out coal, but while taking care of the people with leaving no one behind. So from this context, the social transformation may increase vulnerability and further exacerbate inequality. So I'd like to ask a question to Professor Yamaguchi. So what role does the G7 play in closing the socioeconomic gaps, and how can they promote just transition for all, for ASEAN?
Good. Thank you very much, Chair, for this very important question, and thank you, Dr. Dina, for the very interesting intervention. And to answer your question, yes, definitely, the G7 has an important role in closing socioeconomic gaps and promoting a just transition for all. And actually, in the latest communiqué, the G7 ministers of climate, energy, and environment meeting in Sapporo earlier this month really committed to work toward a decision at UNFCCC COP27 to support a just transition. So this underscores really the importance of supporting the workers and impacted the communities and maximizing the socioeconomic benefit as a part of the transition to a net zero emission for all countries. In this context, it is very important that, as emphasized at this morning's session, the G7 countries needs to work toward a fair and inclusive transition, meaning respecting the human rights and prioritizing the need of the most vulnerable and marginalized. And the United Nations University Institute for the Advanced Study of Sustainability, our institute, strongly support this recommendation because, in fact, our recent studies really focusing on, with the evidence, on how to support vulnerable the population in the transition with the carbon neutrality strategies. So our studies, in fact, stress that government, particularly G7 countries, should play a key role in promoting universal access of decarbonized technologies and practices. So for this end, we need to first to identify the vulnerable energy users where they're located and enhance the support measures for such a population. And second, placing inclusion at the center of the strategy, particularly in developing countries. So with our study findings, together with the T7 task force issue paper, I'd like to particularly emphasize on the four the important recommendation, which include safety net, integrated, the integrated social protection, reskilling, and finance, as the Professor Mattis has mentioned. So first, it is very important to strengthen the social safety net, particularly for workers in the carbon-intensive industries, and to mitigate the disruption caused by such a transition. For this, we do have very interesting, successful examples already from the G7 countries. For example, the UK, with the Green Job Challenge Fund, it expanded unemployment benefit through the increasing the eligibility, the criteria. That's very important example. And in Canada and France, they really support the transition to green jobs with more investment in the social infrastructure, including affordable housing and childcare to support the workers and their families in energy-intensive sectors. And the UK also has a energy price guarantee program where the most vulnerable, the UK household, will continue to receive £1,200 support. So these best practices shall be disseminated to the other countries with the technical assistance where and when needed. Second, promoting the public transportation, renewable energy, and sustainable buildings and electric mobility. This is really to enhance integrated social protection and creating green jobs and improving the mobility for the people left behind. So G7 can work with the policymakers in the countries with the limited the nationwide social protection system to support in coupling the subsidy and social protection, the reform, and supporting those vulnerable the groups to use the energy system transformation as a stepping stone to escape the poverty. And in fact, our study, the recent study and policy brief, identified a good case from the Philippines by introducing energy tax with the electricity discount for the senior citizens and cash transfer to marginalized groups and the public transport assistance program. So all of those integrated, the system is very important, really to widen the benefit for the marginalized, the place. And third, a very important question of reskilling and continuing the education. So I have worked for the university over 20 years, so I really believe in reskilling is necessary for any citizen in any member state. And I believe the G7 should promote those engineering managerial skills and training for the energy-related industries and broader sustainability transitions. For example, Germany has been very active in promoting funding for the workers retrained for jobs in the renewable energy sector and beyond. And in fact, in COP27 last year in Egypt, there was a future resilience pavilion that organized by UNFCCC. And they had shared so many practical examples for the reskilling training for those the intensive, energy-intensive industries. And I believe the think tank, the think tank 7, with the think tank and research institutions, we're in a very good position to disseminate those examples and trying to find the same languages to apply to the different countries. And also, the country must ensure the education system resilient to the impact of the climate change and natural disasters, and particularly in vulnerable regions like Asia and the Pacific. And our recent study identified, for example, Bangladesh adopted a national strategy to manage disaster and climate included displacement, which explicitly ensures the right of education for the displaced population. And the small island, Tuvalu, is also strengthening its education sector, the resilience to the natural disaster and climate change. And all of these studies are widely disseminated, and I really trust the positive influence to the countries. Okay, so the finance, I have another the segment of the finance, but I think we can discuss it in the Q&A, the questions. Thank you.
Great, thank you very much. Okay, so the fourth, last but not least, Dr. Dennis Snower, thank you very much for your great speech at the last session, but everyone is interested in hearing about well-being and beyond GDP, but I will ask you in the second round. But first, I want to ask you about, many other panels say the importance of enhancing synergy or climate change with leaving no one behind. So from this context, tracking and measuring the progress for just transition is pretty much important from the context of synergies. For that UN Sustainable Development Report, Global Sustainable Development mentions the issue is silos of each SDGs. So could you please explain the importance of monitoring other dimension of prosperity as well as interlinkages among the SDGs, including synergy and trade-offs, which influence the achievements for all of us?
Good, thank you very much. I think just energy transition is obviously a vitally important goal that has implications for a good number of SDGs. The question that I think should be asked to start out with is, when proposals are made on how to achieve just energy transition, to whom are these proposals addressed? And the answer usually is they are addressed either to governments, who provide regulations or tax subsidy incentives or laws that need to be changed. Or they are addressed to market mechanisms via the government that need to adjust. And one other aspect of this that's particularly important for the just energy transition is addressing society. People who do not operate through the market and who are not government officials, civil society, who interact with one another through interpersonal connections, they also need to be addressed. And the only way that this just energy transition can be achieved is if the government, the market, and civil society all pull in the same direction. And one thing that that implies is that not only must market mechanisms be consistent with what the government proposes, so, for example, fossil fuel subsidies are completely inconsistent with government proposals to achieve just energy transition, but you also need to make the social policy consistent with these other mechanisms. So when it has been proposed that you need to protect the vulnerable and inclusion and the social safety net, social protections, they need to be linked to the just energy transition policies so that people have an incentive to comply, and they also need to be given a sense of agency in doing so. And agency can be provided by the principle of subsidiarity. That is, find the lowest level at which just energy transition can be implemented, and all the levels from macro to micro will be relevant, and make sure that it is the lowest level that deals with things. That still leaves a lot for the government to do. But the most interesting level, I think, again, exists in the social level. Because in the social level, there are two things to take into account. One are internal mechanisms, things that operate inside the head, and they are measuring things like solidarity and agency that are promoted towards a just energy transition, become important to motivate people, because if they feel that their sense of social belonging and their sense of agency is enhanced through doing things that promote just energy transition, there'll be more compliance. And the second is their external mechanisms for achieving this in a social setting. And there, thinking of Ostrom's core design principles becomes relevant. You need to have a strong group identity. You need an equitable distribution of benefits and costs so that everyone can gain in a broad sense. Inclusive decision-making, monitoring of what people do, then graduated responses in terms of rewards and punishments for helpful and unhelpful behavior, fast and cheap dispute resolution mechanisms, recognition of the authority to govern at different levels and polycentric governance, all important. And so, therefore, I think just energy transition should be seen as a multifaceted government approach that goes from macro to micro. It involves a whole of government approach across different government silos, and it involves society as well as government and the market.
Great. Yeah, thank you very much. Okay, great. So, yeah, according to the scenario, I asked to pose a second question consecutively. So then, at the last session, then there are a lot of questions about, for example, definition of well-being, and also what is the difference on the impression about towards well-being between the global north and global south. So one of the key actions for recommendation is to establish integrate a robust mechanism to monitor the just transition, including well-being. So, and also there is a role of G7 leaders. So I want to ask you how what is the role of G7 to support new measures of well-being? Then for the second round, please introduce within 5 minutes. Thank you very much.
Okay, yes, I'll be very brief.
Yeah.
What I have suggested is that there seem to be 4 common sources of well-being that are applicable across countries and nations. And one is social belonging or solidarity. The other is agency or personal empowerment. The third is material gain, a roof over your head, food in your tummy. And the fourth is environmental sustainability. So solidarity, agency, gain, environment. SAGE, SAGE, the SAGE approach. And those are sources of well-being that are largely independent of one another, and they can guide the just transition. Why? Because what makes the just transition important? It is because it promotes well-being. It obviously promotes environmental sustainability. The just side deals with social mechanisms, gives people a sense of solidarity and agency and equal distribution. Now, therefore, it's clear that these 4 sources of well-being need to be activated to promote the just transition. So therefore, the question that one needs to ask with regard to SAGE, solidarity, agency, gain, and environmental sustainability, is how can social solidarity be promoted in the service of the just transition? How can you mobilize social groups? How can agency be promoted? Which means that every individual needs to know, I am empowered to do such and such for the purpose of achieving a just transition. How can just transition be reconcilable with material gain? That means, how can I become better off as a result of that? And obviously, the transition feeds into environmental sustainability. So if all 4, or at least the balance of the 4, are such that everyone feels that they have gained on balance, then the just transition will have been successful. And that, I think, provides a good framework for assessing the breadth of policy that is necessary for the just transition to be achieved. So the sources of well-being are important as indicators for what policy needs to do in order to address the sources of well-being that drive the just transition.
Okay, great. Thank you very much. But anyway, I acknowledge that G7 leaders should push to promote.
Could I just say, and therefore it is, and thank you so much for reminding me of my punchline, which is that it would be very important for G7 leaders to propose that well-being be measured along these 4 dimensions consistently across country from year to year, so as to evaluate success, not only with regard to just transition, but with regard to all their other policies as well.
Great. Thank you very much for your excellent comments. So now I'd like to ask a second question to Professor Meguchi. We want to discuss the pretty much important issues, education and capacity building. So the issue paper also recommends the G7 leaders enhance support for the Global South to promote carbon neutral and sustainable development, food and energy system. So how can the G7 further contribute by strengthening institutional capabilities and empowering youth? The floor is.
And thank you, Chair, for this very important question again. And in fact, sessions like this, we are looking at the issues from the different perspectives, and I think including the panelists and the audience, we are filled with so many information knowledges, right? So I just want to give one very important message from my intervention, the response. Definitely, G7 and G20 should collaborate for the capacity development of the experts and the youth. Okay, so the institutional capacity building global south, but as well as the importance of the youth, the empowerment. So we are the research and the educational institutions, so we do believe in the importance of the providing the formal education as well as the informal, non-formal, the capacity, the development. And from our experiences, having worked with the member state and institution and individual, the level, the one important message is that when we are talking about the capacity building program, it is very important to encompass national, local government, the programs, institutional level programs, but at the same time, individual, the empowerment. And we can really share some of those examples at the national level. And we work a lot with the member state, but it is very important to collaborate with the government, in national and local government, with the practical training, the courses. And we actually trained the government officials in Thailand in developing their specific net zero strategies in partnership with the Ministry of Natural Resources and Environment of Thailand. But at the same time, we involved the other member states, such as the Korean Government Research Institute, so that they can really collaborate with their strategies. And at the previous session, before this session, I attended another Wellbeing and Agenda 2030. There was a very important message that local government are often less paid attention. But it is really the local government officials who really have to make a change at the community level. So in our institute, we have been involved in the Mayor's Academy in the Asian Pacific, really to strengthen new and young the governor and the mayor of the region. And this is really important. We collaborate with the UNESCAP and UN Habitat and other partners. But what we do is we create very specific modules, for example, modules on the local finance, and they will be equipped with the specific skills, okay, and their capacities, really to translate those modules into their own the strategies. And we have actually worked with the 43 mayors from 15 countries, including those are the least developed countries or the small island. And what was the great benefit of this Mayor's Academy at the local, the government and officials, was that they really share their own experiences. Because during the COVID, they faced very similar the issues and challenges. And the practical way to finding solution was very, very useful for those new and the young, the mayors. And the institutional level, we do have quite a number of network with the universities. For example, the UNU, SDGs Universities Platform. We mobilize over 30 prominent universities to share the experiences, but also to come out with the integrated SDG curriculum, for example. We do the same with the Asian Pacific. So I think they can really influence to each other at the institutional level. And most importantly, at the individual or the public level, sustainable development can be only achieved if the people from all walks of life are willing to be the part of the solution, right? So in order to promote this segment, the United Nations University, we are providing post-degree programs, and I'm happy to announce this fall, we are starting for the first time the specialization on the Paris Agreement, the post-degree, the program. And we have accepted lots of applications from the South. But we do also work with the candidate from the global North so that they can really integrate their experiences over there together. And definitely non-formal, the informal lifelong learning is very important. And UNU, we have regional centers of expertise on education for sustainable development. We have identified 181 those regional centers where all the local community, they're mobilized, they're using the local resources really to come up with a strategy and implement their education for the sustainable development. So in concluding, I think it's very important when we talk about the capacity building, it should not be just ad hoc, the capacity building. It should be really at the national, local government level, institutional level, individual level, so that the entire society can really pay attention to this whole of society approach. Thank you very much.
Yeah. Thank you very much, Yamaguchi-sensei. Okay, the next I'd like to ask Matsushita-sensei. We should avoid the discussion on the trade-off and synergy between climate action and biodiversity. So I'd like to ask your comments on this matter. Floor is yours.
Thank you very much. Before responding to your question, I'd like to associate myself with what has been said by Dr. Snow and Yamaguchi-sensei. Dr. Snow emphasized the importance of government to provide enabling conditions for well-being and just transition, but at the same time, the importance of the role of the civil society in providing social goods and solidarity in the society to provide social common goods. And Yamaguchi-sensei underlined the importance of capacity building, education, and the role of local governments. And having said that, what has been said by Takemoto-san is very important. Climate change, biodiversity loss, and other environmental crises threaten human and planetary health, including lands and soil, ocean, water, wildlife, and plant health. And as you know, at the COP15 of the Biodiversity Convention, the so-called Kunming-Montreal Global Biodiversity Framework was adopted, which enshrines a whole-of-government and whole-of-society approach, highlighting the need for urgent and concerted efforts fostering transformative change to conserve and restore biodiversity, sustainably use natural resources, and simultaneously meet other global societal goals. A synergetic approach would enhance the effectiveness and quality of outcomes, contribute to the efficient use of resources, promote coherence across sectors and among actors, and encourage the formation of novel partnership. For example, there are cases of trade-offs between renewable energy expansion and ecosystem protection. But these issues can often be resolved through appropriate land use regulations and by listening carefully to the opinions of local residents in the development process. Also, critical minerals are needed for the conversion, for example, internal engine motor, automobiles to electric vehicles or batteries. But consideration must be given to the environmental and social impacts associated with the mining and use of critical minerals. I believe strong environmental, social, and governance standards are vital for achieving responsible and resilient critical mineral supply chains, ensuring local communities benefit and respecting human dignity and human rights while minimizing environmental footprints. And based on these concepts, Task Force 2 issue paper made various recommendations, among others. Implement the global biodiversity framework and expand protected areas in terrestrial, inland, coastal, and marine areas by at least 30% by 2030. This is the famous 30 by 30 target. And promote sustainable agriculture to significantly reduce carbon footprints across the food supply and enhance natural carbon sequestration and food security. Third, strengthen demand-side management to reduce food greenhouse gas emissions and promote dietary change and phase food waste reduction. 4, realign food and agriculture policies with climate change mitigation and biodiversity goals, including the elimination of environmentally harmful agricultural subsidies, reforming land use regulations and land ownership systems, food and environmental taxation and consumer incentives, and increase in investment in adaptation, targeting climate and biodiversity goals and sustainable infrastructure such as public mobility and transportation, buildings, and energy systems. Once again, I would like to emphasize that synergetic and holistic approaches are essential as they recognize that complex problems cannot be solved by silo approach. By taking a more integrated and collaborative approach, we can address issues in a more holistic and effective manner, leading to more sustainable and equitable outcomes. And by adopting such proactive policies, I believe that G7 can take a leadership role in addressing climate change and promoting sustainable food systems and biodiversity conservation, while at the same time ensuring economic prosperity. Thank you.
Great, thank you very much for your important message with regard to the issue on climate change and biodiversity. Then next, Dr. Dina. So we also want to have a discussion on the very basic but pretty much important ones, particularly for the Global South. Yeah, awareness raising and outreach. So yeah, basically they don't have knowledge on this such important but very complex matter. So I'd like to ask you to provide your views on this matter. Floor is yours.
Thank you very much, Akiwa-san. Yeah, I'll try to be brief so we have more Q&A, time for Q&A. Knowledge is really important because for countries who will move from fossil fuel dominated energy system to more renewable energy, they will face unprecedented issues and challenges like, for example, when wind is too weak, where to get energy, or wind is too strong, also it's cause challenge, like who will pay to private companies to compensate for turning off wind turbines. So there are so many unprecedented will be issues, and countries, of course, policymakers realize that, and we're really hungry for knowledge and information. Here, think tanks, I think, can play a great role to providing evidence-based policy recommendations, collect data, analyze data, provide evidence, and so that your policymakers from your countries can take well-informed decisions, help them with giving lessons from other countries, learning from other countries. I think it's really crucial, so countries can maximize the benefits and minimize the cost to make less mistakes. And in the morning, some people really raised important question about letting other countries to participate. And I think Think7 is really great platform for other countries, experts on energy transition from all countries to participate. For this Think7, call for papers was advertised last year openly. Anyone could submit. And actually, our co-authors for the policy brief, which I co-authored, we are all from developing Asia, and it was very surprising how we have to write. We wrote policy recommendations for G7 countries, but using our knowledge of developing Asia. And here my great co-author Anbu here, and the rest of colleagues joined online. So thank you so much.
Great, thank you very much. Excellent. We have 14 minutes to finish, so thank you very much, all panelists, for your very good time management. So now I'd like to open the floor for questions. So please raise a hand. So then the first one is the gentleman over there. Then the next one is, sorry, the ladies, I think. So the third one is the person over there. So after I would like to ask the gentleman for your question.
Yeah.
Please identify your name and.
Yeah. My name is Kim Schumacher. I'm an associate professor at Kyushu University, and I have a question for the panelists for something that has not been mentioned, but is very crucial, because there's always the statistic that we already use 2 planets in terms of resources. So we are already overshooting what the planet can regenerate. So I wonder how they feel about the concept of degrowth, because if we talk about the G7 and we talk about industrialized countries, there's always the question, if we already use too many resources as it is, is there a need for degrowth of industrialized countries? Because there's always the question, do people in industrialized countries want to give up their lifestyles? Or can we basically fault emerging economies for wanting to get those lifestyles?
Good, thank you. So later, so ask us, yes, this person, ladies. Please question really briefly, concise.
Good afternoon, everyone. My name is Hannah Alexis Asilo. I am from the Philippines, and my question is, first, there is a program in the Philippines known as the Jeepney Phase-Out, wherein this phase-out demands jeepney operators to join cooperatives or corporations to help them attain loans and payment plans to buy modern jeepneys. So the program intends to give a 5.6% subsidy with 6% interest rate. However, this program is deemed as anti-poor, as not everyone can afford the cost of the modern jeepneys, which is over 10 times than the traditional jeepneys. So my question is, how should you develop a program in order for it to be environmentally sustainable and socially acceptable, hence to achieve just transition, considering that setting where promotion of electric mobility and subsidy was already present, but is still not seen as successful?
Okay, thank you. The third, please.
Thank you. Masanori Kobayashi from the Ocean Policy Research Institute of the Sasakawa Peace Foundations. I just wanted to hear about the reflection on the outcome of the G7 climate, energy, and environment ministerial meeting held in Sapporo. Obviously, there was a gap, and I think one of the examples was target year for phasing out coal-based power plant. 2030 was proposed, but it wasn't agreed. Partly, it was reported that Japan was not yet ready. I think that Germany took this G7 presidency process as a kind of interactive process to year-round to organize initiatives. And I just wondered if you have any suggestion, Dr. Dennis, about Japan or Japanese think tank or stakeholders as to what we can still do for the remaining 7 months under Japan's presidency. Thank you.
Okay, so there are 3 questions from 3 persons. One is, degrowth. So I think it's related to the well-being and other matters. So may I ask you to, Dennis, for response?
I think growth is not an end in itself. It's a means to an end. And everything that is an instrument to an end should be treated as such. And therefore, if degrowth becomes an objective, then one is confusing ends and means. Now, I do believe that it is necessary to redefine what profit is and what well-being is. So profit should be redefined to include a charge for maintaining and regenerating natural capital. And if it had that, and it were still possible to grow, then there is no case for degrowth. Mm-hmm. It may turn out that it may be difficult to grow if such a charge is imposed, and in that case, I rest my case. But I think to have a charge that governments impose as part of the profit mechanism would be important on account of the precautionary principle. We don't know what destabilization of the environment and the climate means, and therefore maintaining it would be really important. And similarly for well-being, I think GDP does not include damages to environmental capital, nor to social capital, and therefore including that would again be a good
Okay, great. Thank you very much. For the next question related to the subsidy program to the Japanese for electrification in Philippines, I think the Professor Yamaguchi or Dr. Dina may respond to how to improve if you have maybe some comments. Yeah, so Dina, please.
I think hard for me to explain. So I understood the problem in Philippines to get the subsidized loans because it's not affordable, right? So same I had in my country whenever government provided subsidized loan or some program, I was like, for me it was a struggle to get for initial payment or although the program targeting low-income people, right? So I also was one of them, but I don't know how to answer your question. I think maybe after let's talk, and maybe I can come up with something.
Okay, great. So for the third question is related to the outcome of the G7 Environmental Ministry meeting. So I ask Matsuda Sensei and Yamaguchi Sensei for the response for both. Yes.
Thank you very much. As for the evaluation of the outcomes of the ministerial conference on climate, energy, and environment, I think at least the ministers agreed to phase out fossil fuel, phase down fossil fuel. But as far as I understand, there was no deadline set for the phasing out of coal. And there was no numerical target for the expansion of, for example, electric vehicles. And there was no sort of clear-cut leadership on the part of the G7 ministers. So I'm afraid the outcomes are not very satisfactory because the message from the science is very clear. Like, as I said in the IPCC report, we have to reduce certain percentage of greenhouse gases by certain timelines. So we have to respect the message from the science. And also, of course, there are various different situations in different countries. And the goal is, of course, to to achieve 1.5 centigrade degree increase, I mean, to contain the increase of global temperature by 1.5 degrees. And the minister said that there are different routes to arrive at the goal, but some routes are not good routes. Some routes are dead end, or some routes are, if you go this way, you may lose your goals. So you have to be very clear. You have to take the right route to attain the target. So that is why you have to listen to the message of the science. Thank you very much.
Thank you. So, Professor Miyaguchi.
Thank you very much. Very interesting question, but I have a bit of the different view for this decision. As a United Nations civil servant, I have been working with the different member states, and it's very complicated matter to come up with the consolidated, particularly with the quantifiable target. Okay, so this is not only the question for the energy and climate, the environment ministers meeting, but what I want to share, I'm a bit optimistic from my experience, because around this G7 Minister of Climate, Energy and Environment meeting, there was a lot of side events taking place. And I was in Sapporo a few weeks ago to attend this pre-event at the Hokkaido, the university, the expert and the local, the government, policymakers got together, and I have learned so many initiatives already taking place in Sapporo and all over the Hokkaido or the beyond. And I think those ministerial conference taking place at that site really increase the understanding and increase the awareness of what are the issues and what has to be done. So not having joint targeted communicates one thing, but definitely I think those discussion and issues like your question is really the raising every single people's awareness. So from my experience, I'm a bit more optimistic, because think about it, 5 years ago, are we really thinking this urgency at the living, the level? Probably we didn't. But now, I think we have more information, we have more data, and we have more dialogue taking place. And this is really the important process and the series of opportunities that every single of us can be able to be involved.
Okay, great. Thank you very much. So, sorry, it's just time to finish. So, thank you very much for joining today's session. So, lastly, I'd like to ask you to give a big hand for these all panelists. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much.